Before the collapse, before the dust storms swallowed the sky, before fathers whispered apologies at dinner tables with no food, there was a moment, small, fragile, almost innocent, where America believed it was untouchable. That belief would become the spark that burned a generation. This is not just the story of an economic disaster. It is the story of how a nation went to sleep wealthy and woke up broken, terrified, breathless. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to hear is the kind of history they never teach you, the kind that feels too dark, too human, and too real. Imagine opening your eyes in 1922. The war is over. The air tastes like victory and cigarette smoke. Cities hum like living machines, and people walk with a swagger that makes you think the future is something they can hold between their fingers. New York rises upward, steel skeletons of skyscrapers, stabbing the sky as if America is daring God to blink. Radios crackle in 10 million homes, pumping jazz into living rooms like a heartbeat. Toasters, vacuum cleaners, electric lights, modern miracles that convince the country it has conquered chaos. But beneath the music, beneath the laughter, a thin crack forms, almost invisible. While cities glow with electricity, rural America drowns in silence. Farmers who once fed armies now can't even feed themselves. Wartime boom turns to peacetime betrayal. Wheat prices crash. Corn collapses. Tractors bought with borrowed money sit in the fields like iron tombstones. Families pray for rain that doesn't come, for mercy that isn't sent. Their desperation is quiet, but it is growing like a fuse burning towards something explosive. In the cities, though, nobody hears the fuse. They're too busy buying things they can't afford. Buy now, pay later becomes the new religion. Radios, cars, furniture. Everything is sold on easy credit. People walk into banks with nothing but ambition, and the banks hand them dreams wrapped in paper contracts. Installment plans feel like magic spells. With a signature and a handshake, even the poorest clerk can own a shiny new Ford. And nobody stops to wonder who will pay when the bill finally arrives. But the real fever is on Wall Street. The stock market becomes a temple, and everyone becomes a worshiper. Barbers, bakers, shoe shine boys, they all preach the gospel of stocks only go up. Margin loans let anyone buy $100 of stock with just $10 down. It feels like alchemy turning pennies into gold. Crowds swarm brokerage houses like moths around a flame, unaware of how hot that flame is becoming. Greed spreads faster than jazz on the radio, and the country confuses delirium for destiny. Holding companies sprout like weeds. They own other holding companies that own absolutely nothing. Towers of empty promises built on air, wobbling in the financial wind. A few scholars try to warn the nation that something is wrong. Economist Roger Babson stands on stage in 1929 and declares a crash is coming. But his voice is drowned out by the brass of jazz bands and the thunder of investors cheering. Why listen to a prophet of doom when the line is going up and your self-esteem is going with it? Behind the champagne smiles and glittering stock tickers, fractures deepen. Rural debt stretches like an overpulled rope. Consumer loans balloon. Families sink quietly beneath the weight of dreams they cannot afford. Banks drunk on optimism lend money as if the future is guaranteed. No one checks the foundation. No one asks whether the American miracle is built on bedrock or quicksand. And then October arrives, crisp, bright, unsuspecting. Newspapers boast record highs. Investors brag in barbershops and hotel lobbies. It'll never end, they say. We're living in the golden age. But history has a cruel sense of timing. On October 29, 1929, the golden age ends so violently that the echoes of its collapse will haunt the world for decades. They will call it Black Tuesday, and America will never be the same. The stock market doesn't just fall, it detonates. Ticker tapes spit red numbers like they're bleeding. Traders scream until their voices break. Phones ring like alarms in a burning building. One man suffers a heart attack, survives, looks at his portfolio, and suffers another. $14 billion disappear in a single day. Not abstract dollars, home savings, college funds, dignity. Gone as if someone pulled the floor out from under the entire nation. Crowds gather outside the New York Stock Exchange in stunned silence. Some cry, some stare, some murmur prayers they haven't spoken since childhood. It feels like the country is cracked open, revealing something fragile and mortal beneath all its steel and jazz. The Roaring '20s don't simply end. They collapse face first into a brick wall while carrying everyone's future on their back. And this brutal day is only the beginning of a darkness America is not prepared to face. The crash triggers something far more terrifying than panic. It triggers the truth. The truth that much of the wealth people believe they owned never existed at all. It had been numbers on paper, fragile as frost. And now margin calls sweep across the country like a scythe. Investors who bought $100 of stock with $10 down now owe the remaining $90 immediately. Phones ring with impossible demands. People who were rich on Monday are bankrupt by Thursday. Brokers stare at balance sheets as if they're staring into the face of a ghost that has come to collect. Then the banks begin to fall, marble pillars, gold-trimmed vaults, polished oak desks. Symbols of stability reveal themselves as stage props in a collapsing theater. Banks had loaned money to investors who can't repay. They had gambled deposits on the stock market, and now the market is burning. So one by one, banks simply die. A bank does not make a sound when it collapses. It is not an explosion. It is a lock clicking shut, a teller lowering his eyes, a line of people staring at a closed sign like it's a death certificate. Bank runs erupt across America. People sprint, not walk, not hurry, sprint to their local branches, banging on doors, begging for their life savings. But the cash isn't inside. It never was. Bankers try to calm the crowds with trembling voices. Your money is safe, they say. Completely safe. But even they don't believe it. Families lose everything. Grandparents' bonds become worthless slips of paper. Mothers watch their savings evaporate. A child named Timmy becomes the wealthiest person in the house, not because he has more, but because his piggy bank is the only thing left untouched. And the disaster jumps the ocean. American banks, desperate for cash demand repayment from Europe. But Europe is already staggering from the ruins of World War I. Germany collapses again. Britain wobbles. Businesses crumble like sandcastles hit by a wave. Global trade, once the great artery of prosperity, shrinks by half in just 3 years. Half. Factories shut down. Ships rust in harbors. Nations that only recently dreamed of progress now dream of bread. Yet amidst the chaos comes denial loud and bright as a carnival. Newspapers try to soothe the public with headlines like market adjusts and investors take profits. Right below the cheerful print is a photo of a man pawning his wedding ring so he can buy bread for his children. Politicians repeat empty reassurances. The fundamentals are strong. Radio hosts laugh nervously. Bankers in silk vests smile for cameras with eyes that beg for mercy. Hope becomes a currency even more unstable than the dollar. President Herbert Hoover speaks calmly into the radio, promising stability, insisting the worst is over, declaring the economy fundamentally sound. Millions sit in dark kitchens listening to his voice echo through empty rooms. They wonder which part of that sentence is meant to help a family that hasn't eaten meat in weeks. Hoover clings to optimism, not out of cruelty, but fear that admitting the truth will shatter what little confidence remains. But the truth doesn't need an invitation. It walks through the front door. The crash wasn't the bottom. It was the trap door. And what waited below was a darkness few Americans could imagine. By 1931, unemployment explodes to 25%. 1 in every 4 workers is jobless.
Detroit, once a roaring engine of industry, becomes a graveyard of silent factories. Massive machines that once assembled cars now sit cold, like abandoned beasts of steel. Men gather at factory gates at dawn, staring through iron bars as if staring at a future they can no longer reach. Bread lines grow longer than city blocks. Mothers arrive before sunrise to secure a place in line for soup so thin you can see the bottom of the bowl through it. Children stand quietly beside them, too weak to complain, too hungry to cry. Teachers report students fainting during class, not from boredom but from starvation. Hunger is no longer a metaphor. It is a presence, a shadow that sits at every kitchen table and asks, "What do you have left for me today?" The suicide rate rises so fast that newspapers stop printing all the names. They can't keep up. Behind each statistic is a person who once believed in the American dream, who once thought hard work guaranteed stability. Marriage rates collapse, birth rates fall. Couples put their futures on hold because they cannot promise each other even a single meal. Hope becomes fragile, brittle as a dry twig. And then, as if the world hasn't suffered enough, nature joins the assault. The sky turns black. Years of over-farming have left the Great Plains exposed. When the winds arrive, they whip dust into monstrous storms, towering, suffocating, biblical. Black blizzards, they call them. Dust pours into homes, coats sleeping children, buries crops, kills livestock. Families wake to find their living rooms filled with earth as if the land itself has crawled inside to die alongside them. Millions flee west with whatever fits into their broken-down cars. California or bust, the signs read. But for many, the road leads only to more exhaustion, more hunger, more heartbreak. President Hoover tries to stop the bleeding with small measures, volunteerism campaigns, limited relief programs, the beginnings of public works. He commissions the Hoover Dam, a colossal concrete miracle rising out of the desert. But dams cannot feed starving children in Chicago or shelter families sleeping under bridges in St. Louis. Hoover refuses large-scale federal aid, calling it dangerous, un-American, a threat to individual spirit. But by then, Americans no longer debate ideology, they debate survival. And to the hungry Hoover's words sound less like leadership and more like distance. Hoover's name becomes a symbol of suffering. Hooverville's shantytowns of cardboard tar paper and scavenged wood spread across the nation like open wounds. Hoover blankets become slang for newspapers used as makeshift bedding. Hoover flags, empty pockets turned inside out, flutter from trousers like silent protests against a government that seems to have forgotten its people. These aren't just jokes. They are coping mechanisms carved from pain, little attempts to laugh while the world collapses. Then comes the breaking point. In the blistering summer of 1932, thousands of World War I veterans, men who once defended their country with rifles and bayonets, marched to Washington, D.C. They are starving, jobless, forgotten. They were promised bonuses for their service decades in the future. But they need those bonuses now. Their children need milk now. So they build a tent city near the Capitol and wait peacefully for Congress to hear their pleas. Congress refuses. Hoover refuses. And then the army arrives. Generals lead troops armed with tear gas, bayonets, and cavalry. Flames rise as soldiers burn the veterans' camps, destroying tents, personal belongings, children's toys. Families flee into choking clouds of smoke. Newspapers capture the horror, the United States military attacking its own heroes. For many Americans, this is the moment something inside them snaps. The Depression wasn't just economic anymore, it was moral, it was psychological. It was a nation watching its own reflection and recoiling in disbelief. Radical ideas spread like wildfire through the abandoned factories and crowded bread lines. Socialist rallies grow larger, communist recruiters find willing listeners, not because people admire theory, but because capitalism feels like a house that has collapsed on top of them. Bank robbers such as John Dillinger, Bonnie, and Clyde Pretty Boy Floyd, figures who should have been villains, become folk heroes. They steal from the institutions seen as responsible for the suffering. Crowds cheer their exploits in newspapers. Desperation rewrites morality. America isn't just broke, it is broken. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, something stubborn remains: endurance. People hold each other up when the world refuses to. Migrant families share food with strangers. Churches convert basements into makeshift shelters. Men walk hundreds of miles looking for work they know they will never find. Children try to comfort their parents by pretending they aren't hungry. Survival becomes an act of defiance, a silent vow whispered in the dark. We will not go quietly. But even endurance has limits. By early 1933, the nation feels like a body bleeding out. Banks fail weekly, factories stand silent, the dust storms worsen, the future collapses into a shadow. And then on March 4th, millions of Americans gather around radios to hear the voice of a new president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt steps to the podium. His tone is firm, steady, almost warm. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he declares. Not banks, not dust, not hunger, but fear. And in that moment, a spark returns to the American spirit. Roosevelt does not wait. Within days, he launches the Civilian Conservation Corps. Young men wearing threadbare clothes are handed shovels, tents, and a purpose they haven't felt in years. You're here to plant trees and save the country, the officers say. Some of the boys laugh for the first time in months. Camps rise across forests and fields. Roads are built, trails carved, rivers cleared. The CCC doesn't just restore land, it restores hope. For thousands of families, the sound of coins dropping onto the kitchen table each month is the sweetest music they've heard since before the crash. Then comes the Works Progress Administration. Millions of Americans are hired to build schools, bridges, highways, post offices. The WPA becomes an army of creators. Men who once stood in bread lines now stand on scaffolding. Their hands, once idle, grip steel beams and brick trowels. They build not just structures, but dignity. The skyline begins to rise again, not in celebration, but in determination. Each brick laid feels like a small rebellion against despair. In the Tennessee Valley, FDR unleashes the TVA, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in world history. Dams rise across the river valley. Entire regions that lived in darkness for generations suddenly glow with electric light. Families gather around radios, not because they finally own one, but because for the first time they have electricity to plug it in. The hum of turbines echoes through mountains and valleys like a new heartbeat for a recovering nation. Slowly, painfully, unmistakably, the country begins to breathe again. But Roosevelt understands that rebuilding jobs is not enough. America must rebuild trust. So he targets the very machine that once devoured the nation Wall Street. The Securities and Exchange Commission is born a watchdog with teeth tasked with dragging the stock market out of the shadows and forcing honesty where lies once lived. Crooked brokers, fraudulent companies, and pyramid-like holding schemes face a new reality: regulation. The Wild West of finance becomes a patrolled frontier. For the first time in years, Americans begin to believe the system might not betray them again. Then comes the FDIC, 3 letters that will heal something deeper than the economy people's fear. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation tells citizens that their savings are protected, that no bank failure will steal their future again. It is not glamorous, it is not bold. But when banks reopen, something miraculous happens. People walk in not to withdraw everything in a panic, but to deposit. Slowly, hope becomes tangible again, measured in bills and coins, in smiles exchanged between tellers and weary customers who dare to believe in safety. Roosevelt pushes further with Social Security. It is a promise carved into law. You will not be abandoned in old age. You will not work until you collapse. The program does not make anyone rich, but it makes millions feel seen by a government that for years felt distant and indifferent. For elderly Americans, many of whom had spent the Depression sitting on porch swings wondering how many meals they had left, Social Security feels like a hand reaching out of the darkness. Even artists find a place in the recovery. The Federal Arts Project hires painters, writers, photographers, people whose talents were once dismissed as luxuries. Their job is to capture the soul of a wounded nation. Dorothea Lange takes a photograph of a migrant mother that becomes the face of the decade. Her eyes don't say, "We survived." They say we're surviving, as if endurance itself has become a form of art. Murals bloom on post office walls. Plays are written, songs composed. Creativity becomes a lifeline, proving that even in despair, humans crave beauty. Hollywood steps in too. As families scrape together nickels to sit in dark theaters, the silver screen becomes an escape hatch from reality. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz transforms a gray world into a realm of impossible color. Audiences gasp as Dorothy opens the door to Technicolor magic. For 2 precious hours, people forget hunger banks, dust storms, hopeless nights. Cinema becomes a sanctuary, reminding Americans that imagination can outlive hardship. Cities begin to buzz again. Restaurants reopen, though their menus are leaner. Barbershops fill with laughter that had vanished for years. Radios play swing music that sounds like the nation's heartbeat returning. If you look closely at the skyline, you can almost see the difference buildings rising, not out of arrogance or greed, but out of resilience. Recovery isn't glamorous, it's subtle, fragile, something you feel before you can measure. But it's there. Factories begin to hum once more, but what spills from assembly lines has changed. No longer just cars and refrigerators, now helmets, boots, ammunition. The world is shifting. Tensions rise across oceans. A new storm gathers, darker and far more violent than the dust storms that once smothered Oklahoma. America is recovering, but not for peace. This time, recovery lays the foundation for war. The engines roar like they're preparing for something massive, something inevitable. Americans still tender from a decade of trauma sense the world tightening again. Families listen to radio broadcasts about Europe with a familiar dread. Hitler rises. Nations fracture. A different kind of darkness creeps across headlines. Yet factories hiring again means food on tables. It means fathers returning home with paychecks. It means a sense of purpose, replacing the despair that once strangled entire towns. The Depression is fading, but its scars remain etched into millions of hearts. And then almost quietly, the Great Depression ends, not with a grand celebration, not with fireworks or parades, but with work, hard, relentless, exhausting work. The Depression ends because millions of Americans pick up tools, punch time cards, and grind through days that feel long and heavy. It ends with blistered hands, tired backs, and families daring to hope again. It ends because a nation that once collapsed found the strength to rise piece by piece, breath by breath. Looking back, the Great Depression feels less like a historical event and more like a collective nightmare. One America lived through with eyes wide open. It revealed the fragility of prosperity, the brutality of hunger, and the astonishing resilience of ordinary people. A decade that began with jazz and skyscrapers, ended with dust and despair, only for a new light to emerge from the rubble. And yet, as the nation stood back up, it failed to see what was coming next, something louder, darker, global. The shadow of World War II was already stretching across the horizon. The Great Depression didn't just shatter the economy, it shattered illusions. Before 1929, Americans believed in an unbreakable promise: work hard, follow the rules and prosperity would follow. But the crash revealed something uncomfortable, that even the most disciplined workers could be ruined by forces far beyond their control. It taught a generation that systems fail, leaders misjudge. And entire nations can be blindsided by their own confidence. Trust once broken clings to the edges like smoke after a fire. Rural America, scarred deeper than the rest, struggled to rebuild, even as cities revived. The Dust Bowl left behind an almost lunar wasteland. Abandoned farmhouses dotted the plains like bones of a giant creature no one could name. Families who fled west often found California far less welcoming than the dream they had carried in their hearts. Migrant camps overflowed, labor was cheap, exploitation was common, and yet these families continued planting, harvesting, sweating under a sun that didn't care whether they lived or died. Children who grew up during the Depression carried the era's lessons for life. Some became frugal to the point of obsession, saving bits of string and buttons, because scarcity had once been their teacher. Others feared banks for decades, hiding money in jars, socks, and floorboards. Trauma became inheritance. The Depression wrote itself into their habits, their choices, their anxieties, shaping them long after the economy recovered. A nation can heal on paper long before its people truly do. The wealthy were not spared from transformation either. Many who once lived behind tall fences discovered that wealth could evaporate faster than morning fog. Some rebuilt their fortunes with hardened resolve. Others disappeared from public view, hollowed out by the humiliation of losing everything. The Depression blurred social lines. Doctors stood beside laborers in bread lines, bankers slept in Hoovervilles, and for the first time in modern American history, suffering became a shared experience that refused to discriminate. Relief workers and volunteers became the quiet heroes of the decade. Teachers slipped extra bread to starving children. Neighbors pooled rations so that no family on a block would go completely without. Charity kitchens expanded despite dwindling resources, fueled by the belief that compassion mattered even when hope was scarce. Many lives were saved not by government action or economic intervention, but by ordinary people choosing kindness in the face of devastation. Even as recovery took root, the memory of collapse lingered in every corner of American life. Political debates shifted. Economic theories were rewritten. The government's role in safeguarding citizens expanded dramatically. The laissez-faire dream of the early 20th century had died in the dust storms and breadlines of the Depression. In its place, a new philosophy emerged that government could be a shield when the storms of capitalism grew too strong, a partner when markets failed, a final line of defense against catastrophe. Banks, businesses, and regulators never looked at risk the same way again. The stock market, once a wild carnival of speculation, faced strict oversight. The reckless margin lending that fueled the bubble was banned. Investment firms were forced to separate from banks to prevent conflicts of interest. And for a while, these safeguards worked. They created a generation of stability, a long stretch of prosperity that convinced many that the Depression was a tragedy that would never repeat. But history has a way of testing every assumption sooner or later. As the late 1930s unfolded, the Depression's grip weakened, yet the world began shifting toward another kind of darkness. Radio broadcasts crackled with reports of invasions, dictators, and rising tensions across Europe and Asia. Americans still healing from years of hunger and hardship listened with unease. Some hoped the nation could stay out of foreign conflict. Others feared the storm brewing overseas would inevitably reach American shores. In the shadows of recovery, a new dread stirred the fear that the world was preparing for something far worse than economic collapse. But there was one truth that no one could deny. The Depression had reshaped America into something harder, wiser, more united. The people who survived it had learned to endure the unendurable. They had learned the value of community, of caution, of empathy. They had witnessed the fragility of systems and the strength of human spirit, and these lessons would become vital in the years ahead when global conflict demanded sacrifices that only a hardened nation could bear. As America stood at the edge of a new era, the Great Depression faded into memory, but it never truly disappeared. It lingered in the stories grandparents told at dinner tables, in the faded photographs of dust storms, in the cautious way families save money just in case. It remained a ghost behind the nation's shoulder, whispering reminders of how quickly prosperity can crumble. And while the country prepared to face the monstrous challenges of World War II, the wounds of the Depression shaped its resolve, ensuring that the suffering of the past decade would never be forgotten. Even after the factories roared back to life and war contracts pumped money into every major city, the Depression's shadow followed people like a second spine. It influenced the way families spent, the way politicians campaigned, and the way economists wrote their theories. It changed dinner table conversations, shaped parenting styles, and taught millions that stability was not a birthright, but a privilege that could vanish overnight. The wound was deep, and though it had healed, it had not forgotten how it was made. Parents who survived the darkest years raised their children differently. They taught discipline, caution, and gratitude with a sternness born from hunger. They encouraged saving every penny, fixing, instead of replacing working harder than necessary, because you never know. Their lessons sometimes bordered on paranoia, but beneath the fear lay love, the fierce, protective love of those who had once watched the world collapse and vowed their children would never face the same abyss. Communities that had suffered together remained tightly knit long after prosperity returned. In towns across the Midwest and South, neighbors still checked on each other, remembering the times when a single loaf of bread shared between households meant survival. Social clubs, church groups, and volunteer organizations flourished, strengthened by the memory of collectivism forged in desperation. The Depression had taught them that independence was noble, but interdependence was necessary. Many survivors became the backbone of the American war effort. The same resilience that helped them endure empty cupboards and dust-choked fields now fueled their determination to defeat tyranny abroad. They rationed food with practiced ease, volunteered for scrap drives, and joined the armed forces with a sense of purpose sharpened by hardship. They knew what loss felt like, and they were determined that the world would not fall into another kind of ruin. Ironically, it was the devastation of World War II that finally snapped the last chains of the Depression. The demand for weapons, vehicles, and supplies created a surge of industrial jobs that no government program could match. Unemployment plummeted, wages rose. Factories expanded so rapidly that entire neighborhoods were built just to house the workers. In a strange twist of fate, global conflict, not politics or policy, became the engine that fully pulled America out of economic despair. Yet even as prosperity bloomed, the scars of the Depression remained inked into the national psyche. Those who lived through it spoke of it with a kind of reverent horror. They described the silence of shut-down factories, the humiliation of bread lines, the suffocating fear when banks locked their doors. They remembered the taste of watered-down soup, the sting of sand-laced wind, the nights spent wondering if tomorrow would be worse than today. These memories became a silent warning passed from generation to generation. Writers and historians tried to capture the era, but no book or documentary ever truly matched the weight of lived experience. The Depression wasn't just numbers or policies. It was the sound of children crying from hunger, the sight of fathers sitting motionless at kitchen tables, the feeling of dust settling on skin, like a second layer of despair. It was a decade where the American dream cracked but did not break, a time when resilience mattered more than optimism and survival became an act of everyday courage. Politically, the Depression changed everything. Citizens began expecting more from their government, more protection, more involvement, more empathy. The New Deal reshaped institutions, strengthened safety nets, and forged a relationship between the people and their leaders unlike anything before it. It wasn't perfect. It didn't end the Depression alone. But it reminded millions that leadership wasn't just about speeches, it was about standing beside a nation when it was at its weakest. Economists dissected the era for decades, searching for formulas to prevent another catastrophe. They argued over causes, blamed speculation, blamed the gold standard, blamed global trade imbalances. But beneath the theories lay a simpler truth. The Depression happened because the nation forgot to question its own certainty. Prosperity had made the country reckless. Optimism had blinded it. By the time warnings arrived, the momentum of collapse was unstoppable. The lesson reverberated through history: confidence is fragile and blind confidence is lethal. And so the Great Depression became more than a chapter in history books. It became a cautionary tale whispered beneath the surface of American life. A story parents told their children when they insisted on saving money for a rainy day. A shadow behind economic booms, reminding policymakers that growth is never permanent. A quiet ghost haunting every financial crisis that followed. Because the Depression didn't just shape the generation that lived through it, it shaped every generation that came after. By the time the survivors reached old age, the Great Depression had become more than personal memory. It had become a lens through which they judged every moment of uncertainty. When markets dipped, they felt echoes of 1929. When banks advertised high-interest accounts, they felt a twitch of distrust. They told their grandchildren stories not to frighten them, but to prepare them stories of soup kitchens, dust storms, empty pockets, and the bitter taste of hope stretched thin. For them, history was not distant. It was alive breathing, waiting to remind the world what complacency could cost. Some carried guilt as heavy as hunger, fathers who couldn't feed their families, mothers who watched children starve, men who lost their jobs, and with them, their sense of worth. Even decades later, they spoke of those years with lowered voices as if the memories themselves might shatter if spoken too loudly. Trauma does not fade with prosperity. It lingers in the quiet moments, like when a storm rolls in suddenly, or when a paycheck arrives late, or when the pantry grows a little too empty. The Depression had carved a permanent room inside them. Yet in its harshest way, the Depression also revealed the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. Communities became lifelines. Neighbors became safety nets. Families became unbreakable units forged in fire. Hardship stripped away illusions but strengthened bonds. People who had nothing found ways to share. People who had lost everything found ways to continue. And in these acts of endurance, America discovered a truth often overlooked, that its greatest strength did not come from its wealth, but from its willingness to stand back up after being brought to its knees. As decades passed, the Great Depression evolved from memory into warning. Economists filled textbooks with charts and lessons. Politicians invoked it in speeches. Lawmakers used it to justify reforms. But to the people who lived through it, the Depression was not a concept, it was a feeling. A cold kitchen, a silent evening, a dusty horizon, a father staring at an empty plate, a mother stitching patches onto the same coat year after year, a child watching adults break under the weight of something they couldn't understand. No graph could capture that. History eventually softened the edges of the Depression, but it never erased them. Museums preserved artifacts, ration books, worn shoes, faded photographs. Students studied the decade like an ancient tragedy. But the world's growing distance from the event brought a subtle danger forgetting the warning signs, forgetting the consequences of unchecked greed, forgetting that civilizations are not guaranteed stability. The Depression was a whisper across time, urging generations to remain vigilant, to question certainty, to guard against repeating the same mistakes. Modern crises, from recessions to housing crashes, often drew comparisons to the Great Depression. But those who lived through 1929 insisted the comparisons fell short. Nothing matched the scale of despair they had witnessed. Nothing matched the silence of abandoned factories stretching into the horizon. Nothing matched the collective dread of millions wondering if the country itself was dying. And yet each new crisis revived the ghost, reminding the world that no system, no matter how prosperous, is invincible. The Great Depression also reshaped what it meant to be American. Before, the nation prided itself on individualism, on the belief that success was purely self-made. After Americans understood the value of community safety nets and shared responsibility, the dream did not die, it evolved. It became less about endless wealth and more about stability, dignity, and opportunity. The Depression taught that pride without caution becomes arrogance, and optimism without humility becomes blindness. As the last survivors passed away, their stories became treasured relics. Journalists recorded their voices. Filmmakers captured their faces. Grandchildren preserved their letters, because people understood that once those voices were gone, the world risked losing more than memories, it risked losing wisdom. The Depression generation carried knowledge, etched by suffering knowledge that prosperity should never be taken for granted, and that resilience is a muscle built through adversity. In the end, the Great Depression stands as one of the most defining crucibles of American history. It broke millions, reshaped policy, redefined leadership, and carved a scar across the nation's soul. But it also revealed something profound, that even in the darkest years, when skies turned black, when banks failed, when families starved, people still found ways to endure. They shared warmth, they shared food, they shared hope. The Depression was a story of suffering, yes, but it was also a story of stubborn, unyielding survival. And so, the Great Depression closes not with a triumphant ending, but with a lingering echo, a reminder that prosperity is fragile, that systems can crumble, that human resilience is both the weakness and strength of a nation. The people who survived the 1930s walked through a decade of dust, hunger, and despair, only to rise into a new era shaped by their endurance. Their legacy warns us that history has teeth, that it can bite when least expected, and that the cost of forgetting is always higher than the cost of remembering. Because the real horror of the Great Depression isn't just what happened, it's knowing that it could happen again.